Welcome to One Line Brainwaves. I'm Brandon Staglin, your host, and as a schizophrenia survivor and president of the International Brain Health Research and Advocacy Organization One Mind, I stand for healing. Today's topic on the show is fighting addictions. We have two amazing guests today on the front lines of the fight for better treatments for addiction, both from the science and the advocacy standpoint. We also have singer-songwriter Mary Gauthier, who's going to perform her iconic song, I Drink, related to addiction. A very poignant song. But first, let's start with a little story. So when I was a teenager, I enjoyed spending time with my maternal grandmother. She was about in her 60s, and I'd spend time with her during the summer when my mom was working and she couldn't watch me, and I needed spend time with a family member during that time. And so, but then as I got older, and as she got older, her alcoholism that she had been struggling with and her bipolar disorder, which she also experienced, kind of escalated. And over time, she became hard to relate to. Basically, she would even get aggressive at times, which was disconcerting. And there came a time when my family went to visit her, and she behaved very aggressively, and we decided we couldn't spend time with her anymore for quite a while. And so that was a scary and confusing time for me as a young teenager. I didn't interact with her for several years, and I was just, sad about that. But and sad that I had lost that relationship. But after another 15 years or so, toward the end of my grandmother's life, my mom helped her get into a treatment program for bipolar disorder, and she was able to get sober at the same time. And that's when I was able to reconnect with her and really spend time with her again. I valued that time tremendously in those last few years of her life, getting to know her again and catching up. And I just regret, though, that I had missed those years that her addiction and her bipolar had taken away from our family as being together. With us today is one amazing long Mary Gauthier, who has an inspirational story of her own. Mary is a singer-songwriter, an iconic country music and folk singer, and I want to welcome her back to Brainwaves. Mary, welcome, and thank you for coming back to Brainwaves.
Good to be with you again. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely, so good to see you again. So your wonderful song, I Drink, you say it never could have been written without you having experienced both addiction, the darkness of addiction, and the light of coming through recovery and recovering to sobriety again. Why was that in your experience?
Well, I wrote the song when I was about 5 years sober. And when I was writing it, I was envisioning myself having never gotten sober, and how much further down the line I would have been with my own alcoholism and addiction, and how much more I would be blaming everybody else for my problem, and how much smaller my world would have gotten. So the song was an imagining. But I did it from a place of around 5 years of recovery. So I needed both to be able to articulate the character. It's an interesting. My songs are always this way. I never know if a man or a woman is singing. Gender has always kind of slipped through my fingers anyway. But I don't know if there's a character. It's part me and part. A guy that I knew real well in Boston. He was a great country singer, and he went on to get more and more sick with alcoholism, and eventually he did pass away from the disease. But he was an iconic country singer in the Boston, New Hampshire area, and so it was me picturing Lincoln. His name was John Lincoln Wright. And also myself, sort of a combination of Lincoln and me, and that's how this song was born. And it's been the song that has opened doors for me my whole career. It got me on the Bob Dylan radio show, and Bob read the lyrics and introduced me to the world on his first theme time radio show. It got me a record deal, a publishing deal. It got me cut with Blake Shelton, Tim McGraw. It's been an incredible song, and in retrospect, I don't know how the heck I wrote it. It's one of those gifts that comes once in a lifetime, really.
Thank you. The song is a gift indeed, and it's tremendous to hear how that came out of your experience and how you projected what it would have been like. It's a little bit scary to consider the character in that position. So, like accepting of that person's condition as inevitable and inescapable, it really reaches me deeply that way. You've also said that it's semi-autobiographical.
Yes.
So, and you kind of went over that just now, but it's also one of those special songs that really resonates strongly with people that really connect with it. You know, as you said, Bob Dylan is a big fan of it. I can't think of any higher accolade. Why is it that your personal story and your song resonates with so many people around the world?
Well, you know, I think artists, when they really tell their story and are vulnerable in their work, people see themselves in our life, in our story. We are. I'm no more special or unique than anybody else. I just happen to be someone who's out there telling the story, and willing to do that from a place of emotional honesty. And I think that's the job of the artist. And I think that for me, it's been the reason I've been able to stay sober. It's because I've had this guitar and I've had this calling to be a songwriter, and it's given me purpose, which has really rooted my recovery in something sustainable. Because once you get sober, the challenge is, how do you stay sober?
Right.
And boy, is it a challenge. And I was blessed with, you know, six strings and wood, and I've just held on to this thing and was you know, drowning over and over again, and the music and the songs have been my life raft. And I know a lot of other artists in recovery who'll tell you the same thing, that they were saved by the music, and that goes against actually popular culture, which we read about so many artists who die of addiction. I know far more artists who are saved by the music.
That's awesome. My experience is similar. I deal with depression sometimes, and I take some medication for it. But playing guitar, I do that at least once a week. And when I do it, it's just such a tonic for my soul. Like, I'm able to feel in good spirits again. It lasts for days after I do it. Being connected with the music, connected with the artist who wrote the song I'm playing, it's such an invigorating and calming thing at the same time. I love doing that. So yeah, we're on the same page. Mary, I'd love to hear your song, I Drink. Please perform it for us.
Happy to do it. Thank you so much. Well, he'd get home at 5:30, fix his drink and sit down in his chair, pick a fight with mama, complain about us kids getting in his hair. At night he'd sit alone and smoke. I'd see his frown behind his lighter's flame. Now that same frown's in my mirror. I got my daddy's blood inside my veins. Fish swim, birds fly, daddy's yell, mama's cry. Old men sit and think. I drank. chicken TV dinner, 6 minutes on defrost, 3 on high. Beer to wash it down with, another, then some whiskey on the side. It ain't so bad alone here, it don't bother me that every night's the same. I don't need another lover hanging around trying to make me change. Fish swim, birds fly, lovers leave by and by. Old men sit and think. I drink and I know what I am, but I don't give a damn. Fish swim, birds fly, daddies yell, mamas cry. Old men sit and think. I drink.
Mary, thank you so much. That's such a beautiful song, so poignant and so full of meaning, so elegantly composed in a simple way, but it's just so deep at the same time. Thank you for sharing your song and your story.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having these important conversations.
You're welcome, and I hope your song will reach many people through this webcast as it has already, and inspire them as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, Mary.
Take care.
Bye. So, here now to discuss the subject of addiction and the fight to treat it are two amazing guests on the front line. Dr. Stephan Lammel is an assistant professor of neurobiology at the University of California at Berkeley. He's also a 2019 One Mind Janssen Rising Star Translational Research Awardee for his work to study impulse control and how it relates to the conditions like addictions and eating disorders. Also with us today is Gary Mendell, the founder and CEO of Shatterproof, a national nonprofit fighting the addiction crisis all across the nation through education and advocacy and other programs. Stephan, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here today and to talk about this important topic.
Thank you so much. And Gary, thank you. It's an honor to have you here as well. Thank you both. So Stephan, I'll start with you. What does current brain science tell us about addiction and related disorders like eating disorders and possible ways to address it and treat it?
Yeah, Brandon, that's a very important question. So I want to start maybe by saying, which might surprise you, that drug addiction is one of the leading causes of disability in the world today, with an estimated annual cost to the US of more than $740 billion annually related to crime, lost work productivity, and healthcare. Despite these devastating effects of drug addiction it has on our society and on humanity, we still don't have any effective treatments available. Unfortunately, addiction is still associated with a lot of stigma, which basically makes it difficult for people to get support and help. However, we now know that addiction really changes fundamentally the brain, the biology of the brain. It changes a person's normal needs and desires and replaces them with new priorities which are connected to drug seeking and drug taking behavior. So generally what we see addiction is, and this is a result of these changes in the brain, is a compulsive behavior that weakens the ability to control impulses. despite the negative consequences. And this is a hallmark of addiction, which we see also in many other mental illnesses. And you mentioned, for example, eating disorders. So fundamentally, addiction is a failure to refrain from seeking rewards in the face of aversive consequences. However, Brandon, over the past 2 decades, we have seen compelling advances in our understanding of how addictive drugs affect the brain initially, and with repeated exposure induce longer lasting changes that drive these compulsive seeking and taking of drugs that ultimately defines addiction behavior. So research in the addiction field has now basically established all the molecular and cellular targets of virtually all drugs of abuse. And we have shown that all drugs of abuse similarly affect, and most importantly, what we call the brain reward circuitry, the brain's reward system. This is a system in the brain that controls our responses to emotional stimuli, for example, reward and aversion. It controls our motivation to consume rewards, for example, food, sex, or social interaction. And it shapes future behavior through learning and memory-related functions. All drugs of abuse, including cocaine, opioids, and despite they initially have different effects on the cells in the brain, they ultimately affect the system and strongly activate it, and they corrupt the brain reward system. And what we talk about is they hijack the system, and in the extreme case, it causes an individual to lose control over drug consumption. So where does the research go in the future? So ideally, we would like to reverse these pathological changes in the brain using certain therapeutic approaches. And with new technologies we are using in our lab, for example, optogenetics, we can more clearly define these targets in the brain, these circuits in the brain, and then use, for example, these approaches in animal models to reverse some of the effects of drugs of abuse. And while, for example, optogenetics, we still not use and we have been quite successful, but there are limitations. Optogenetics, for example, is just a laboratory technique. We cannot use this in the brain. But we are trying to translate these experiments from rodents ultimately to therapeutic approaches in humans, where we can use established therapeutic approaches such as the brain stimulation and transcranial magnetic stimulation to find new therapeutic approaches also for drug addiction in the human.
That sounds promising, using things like neurostimulation, and maybe there's some, I don't know, pharmaceutical ways to do it too, but you're the expert here. But it's based on, is it based on the dopamine system in the brain and affecting that, the dopamine circuitry in the brain? And is that because there are like certain imbalances? You kind of went over that, but can you elaborate on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, Brian, that's completely correct. So all drugs of abuse have in common that they affect this reward circuitry, which is basically comprised of the dopamine system. These are cells in our brain that basically produce a chemical messenger substance, dopamine. And drugs of abuse strongly activate this dopamine system and ultimately induce changes in the synapses of the system that leads to what we call drug-evoked plasticity or drug-evoked adaptive behaviors and ultimately addiction. So under normal conditions, this dopamine system is important for reward learning and reward-related behavior. But then the drugs of abuse, they hijack, and the pharmacological power of these drugs of abuse can hijack the system, thus generating an inappropriate learning signal that ultimately leads to compulsive drug intake at the expense of all other behaviors, which we normally do, like eating. And that's when we talk about the addictive state, really.
Yeah.
And so our research has shown that the reward system is more complicated than we have initially thought. So initially we have found, people have thought that this mesolimbic or the dopamine reward system is comprised of the mesolimbic system. Our research has shown that the system not only mediates or is activated in response to reward, but it also activates a response to other emotional stimuli, for example, aversive. And this is mediated in a subsystem of this. And so what we ultimately think that addiction might be an imbalance between reward and aversion, in which this dopamine system is differently affected by the drugs of abuse. However, this research is just at the beginning steps, and we don't really know how these different subcomponents of the mesolimbic dopamine system are affected by drugs of abuse. This is an ongoing question in our research in the lab.
That's amazing. That's fascinating. And that can maybe, that sounds like that underlies the kind of condition that Mary was talking about in her song about. You said how it hijacks kind of the drugs of abuse, hijack the dopamine system, the reward system in the brain, so that people have no interest in things other than taking the drug. And, you know, maybe it lead to something like not seeking social interaction, like she was talking about in the song, not wanting don't need a lever causing me to change, she said, or, you know, don't need things like that. Is that in your experience what happens?
Yeah, that's correct. And especially is one of the major criteria which I mentioned at the beginning. So why do some people take drugs by any possible means, seemingly without regard of the potential of the negative consequences? Why do people that are addicted to drugs engage in these high-risk behavior that normal, not addicted people will not engage in? And this is what we could basically think it could be in this imbalance between this system which has been developed for mediating reward and aversion, but then over time when people take these drugs, they develop the imbalance due to the changes in the plasticity in the synapses that basically control the system. And that changes really the focus of the addicts, in which they only focus on getting the next reward, but this normal behavior of avoiding aversive stimuli is basically suppressed. And maybe changes in the brain, pathological changes in the system underlie these changes in behavior. And we are very interested in understanding this.
That's so important to understand that, so we can develop ways to treat it. Thanks for the work that you do. It's amazing. And Gary, you experienced some of this through your family directly. Tell us about your son, please, Brian, and how he inspired you to start Shatterproof after he was lost to addiction in 2011.
Sure, Brandon. Again, thank you for having me. And Stephan, thank you for all the information you just shared. My son, Brian, was a typical son. Growing up, he was the son that any father could ever dream of. Always hugging me, always smiling, you know, my little companion wherever I went. And as a young boy, he did many of the things that young boys do. Played with little trucks in his room. He chased butterflies, played Little League. And then as a teenager, he did many of the things that teenagers did. And he tried beer and pot, just like many teenagers. But some, approximately 1 in 10, use a substance like that when they're 13, 14, 15, or 16. And it reacts to their brain in a different way. And they start to become more attached to the drug. And ultimately, many become addicted. And through no fault of their own. Didn't do anything different than any other teenager did, or many of the teenagers did in our community. But he, like several others, or many others, became addicted. Once we realized he was having issues, we entered him into a treatment program at the age of 17. And that started a string of 8 different treatment programs over 8 years. And what I didn't know at the time was there was this body of research that had existed during that 8 years, that had been funded by our federal government, that had created this body of knowledge, much of it of what Stephan was just referring to, of evidence-based ways that you can treat this disease. Now, Stephan said in the first part of his remarks that we have yet to come up with a treatment. I suspect, Stephan, correct me if I'm wrong, what he was referring to was a medication like a vaccine that would cure the disease. And Stephan is absolutely correct. But please, the audience listening to this and watching this should not construe that to mean that there aren't evidence-based practices and protocols that treatment programs can follow that have proven without any doubt to improve outcomes, without any doubt to improve outcomes. And what I learned after my son passed away was about this body of knowledge, and that it existed. All the researchers know about it. I'm sure Stephan has read every one of the articles, peer-reviewed, but it's not out in use in our society, not in our healthcare system, nor in our treatment programs. And as a father, I was destroyed. Reading and learning about information after my son died that could have potentially saved his life, and hundreds of thousands of others, if not millions, just like him. Yet this information was being shared among the researchers, and very little that was in use. So that really struck me after Brian passed away. The other thing that struck me was how the shame and stigma affected his ability to recover and lead a full and fulfilling life. What I didn't know, because I was not in a place to understand it when Brian was going through this, was how much shame and stigma destroys people who are addicted. And I just learned just a couple years ago about a recent poll that said 80% of Americans in a recent survey said, I am unwilling to associate with someone addicted as my friend, my coworker, my neighbor, or marry into my family. Even though of those 80% that responded that way, 8 out of 10, most of them thought this was a chronic illness. It's not about whether this is poor character or chronic illness. This is about the public understanding that this is a treatable disease. Sure, as Stephan said, we can't give a vaccine and end it, but it is a treatable disease with success rates no different than diabetes, heart disease, or asthma. Same success rates. But it's not being implemented in our healthcare system. And because of that, of course, I wouldn't want someone who's addicted as my neighbor if he's not going to treatment, or he or she is going to treatment and they're going to treatment program that's not following the right things, and that person's not going to get better. So, in answer to your question, I'm sorry I went on a little longer than maybe I should have, but after my son passed away, I looked at that and said, oh my God, something so tragic that we have information today that can start saving lives tomorrow, and it's not being used. But then I crossed out the word tragic and I put the word hope, because I could see it could be done. This was not about creating a vaccine. This was not about flying somebody to the moon. This was about taking existing research and blocking and tackling and getting it implemented. And when I asked myself why that didn't exist, why that wasn't happening, one reason popped out very clearly. There was the American Cancer Society for Cancer, driving change to ensure that research that existed about cancer was being implemented. There was the American Heart Association. There was Autism Speaks. And there was nothing like that for the disease of addiction on the scale and scope of those organizations. And so knowing that, I decided to leave my career in business, which I did, and spent 2 years building a business plan to launch a national organization on the scale and scope of those. And after 2 years of building a business plan with researchers like Stephan around me, helping me, we narrowed it down into a specific actionable plan, and we launched 6.5 years ago.
Fantastic. I sparked some questions for me as you were talking. First, let me say I'm so sorry for your loss. Brian sounded like a beautiful young man.
Thank you.
Tell how much you care about him still. But your love has turned into something so huge to help people all around the country and the world. I compliment you for that tremendously, for your resilience and your dedication to helping others. You talked about stigma and shame and isolation as a big part of the challenges that Brian faced. How does that integrate with Shatterproof's mission? Is that a major part of what Shatterproof does to help encourage people to seek treatment as well?
Absolutely. Shatterproof has 3 pillars to our work.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, we're joining with others and we're leading a transformation of the treatment system in the United States. That's number one. Number two, second pillar is we're ending the stigma so unjustly associated with this disease and with those who have this disease and the medications to treat this disease. And then third, providing information and resources to families. All 3 things that I didn't have when Brian was alive. You know, on our transformation of the treatment system, it's a 5-point plan. 1 national set of principles of care, drafted, published, brought together 16 health insurers representing the majority of the market. It's now 22 health insurers. All have signed and agree to identifying and rewarding care in their networks that is consistent with these principles. That's number one. Number two, we worked with the American Society of Addiction Medicine and Open Beds. And we just published just 3 weeks ago an assessment for families and those looking for treatment. That is a consumer version of the professional ASAM criteria by the American Society of Addiction Medicine. This is a consumer-friendly 13 questions. Answer these questions. It'll result in a recommendation of one of 5 levels of care to start the patient on the right path of what should I be looking for. Now let's say that standard of care is the type of care is recommended, for example, outpatient. Well, then let's find you a treatment program that's outpatient that delivers quality care based on that original principles of care. So we spent the last 2 years building that, a quality measurement system. It just launched last Tuesday in 6 states. Millions of dollars in funding from some of the largest healthcare foundations in the world. It's called treatmentatlas.org, that anybody who wants to go to it and see it, in 6 states. And the first part of it is we've integrated the assessment. The 4th point of the 5-point plan is changing payment models. We need to create payment models that facilitate quality care, aren't barriers to quality care. And the 5th point of that plan is to get basic education about addiction into medical schools and nursing schools. Not specialty care, but the basics. Just like anyone graduating medical school knows the basics about your physical body, they need to understand the basics about addiction. So that's the 5-point plan. On the 3rd pillar, and I'll finish with stigma to your question, it's about getting this information out to the public. It's giving them information which I didn't have as a family member. So the front end of the quality measurement system and the assessment tool is a consumer-facing website for free. It's in those 6 states. Well, anybody in the country can do the assessment. 5 minutes right now. Go onto our website and just go to Get Help. It's at the top. You can take the assessments right there. 13 questions. Takes 10 minutes. In the 6 states, you have quality information. So that's availability to consumers of this information, which is our 3rd pillar, if you will, getting information to consumers. We're also providing a way for families to engage and support us and work with us. So we used to have 5K walks, which we'll hope bring back in the future. We're launching an event on just went live a couple days ago, but on September 26th, the last Saturday in Recovery Month, families all across the country can come together in their neighborhood by themselves or down their street, walk, run, bike, hike, stand on your head, do a yoga, whatever you want to do an event to support those in recovery. And that's on our website as well. Back to your question, stigma. This all started 15 months ago when I called a partner at McKinsey & Company. And I said, look, Tom, I just met someone at a conference. I was really impressed with his remarks and his knowledge of the industry. And I said, We're working to transform the industry, the treatment industry. We're working with many others as partners. We're getting information out to consumers so they can be helped. But we haven't touched stigma. And to me, it's as equal as either of the other two. We can change the treatment system. But if someone leaves treatment and enters a society where 80% of Americans don't want anything to do with that person, why would that person ever want to go to treatment in the first place? But even if that person went to the best treatment program in the United States and gets out, and 80% of Americans want nothing to do with them, many of those people are going to internalize that and believe it. And believe, I'm not worthy of getting a job. I'm not worthy of being someone's neighbor. I am not worthy of dating my neighbor's daughter. So how does that person live a full and fulfilling life, even with the best treatment in the country? So hard. So Tom, who was the partner at McKinsey, I said, I need your help. I can't afford to pay McKinsey, but you're the largest, one of the largest consulting firms in the world. Would you consider putting a team of people on this for 6 to 9 months, whatever it takes, and let's study. How did our country's views change on HIV/AIDS? What things worked and what things didn't work? How did our country change its views on marriage equality? I remember 20 years ago, you couldn't even join the Boy Scouts if you were gay, and now you can run for president. Well, what things did people do to change that? And what things did people do that didn't work? So would you put a team of people with me and let's study what things worked, what things didn't work, and let's determine, can this be done for addiction? If it can't, I'll cross it off my list and we will have to deal with it. But if it can, work with me and let's build a plan. McKinsey said yes. We worked for 9 months together beautifully in 2019, last year. We finished the plan in December. We just published it, released it a week and a half ago. Be happy to send it to anybody who's interested. It's on our website. Go to the stigma section. Our plan is there. And now we're building a coalition of partners to begin to execute it. And we'd love to work with One Mind and many others to execute it.
Wow, I totally admire your can-do spirit to get these things done. And the magnitude of what you're accomplishing in such a short time, addressing every facet of the addiction crisis in America through that strategy that you have so comprehensively developed. I have great hope that it's going to make a huge difference for people across the country. Stephan, Gary mentioned that there is research that is known that can actually help people with these conditions. What is your knowledge of that, and how has your work contributed to that? And building off of that, is there also a relationship between addiction and other mental illnesses?
Yeah, Brandon, thank you for the question. First of all, I want to say, Gary, thank you for sharing this very personal story. And I also greatly appreciate all the initiative you're taking. And I completely agree with you that stigma in addiction is still a major problem, which for us working in the lab is not really apparent, because for us it's clear it's a biological illness, right? But out there in the general population, this is completely underestimated. So any effort that is put into this to decrease stigma of addiction is incredibly important for the patients, and also basically for accepting addiction as a biological illness, as a mental illness, similar to many other mental illnesses that are very well accepted as biological diseases. So thank you very much for doing this. And now, yeah, so going back to Brandon's question, how often does substance abuse occur alongside other mental illnesses? So that's actually a very important problem, and which we talk about, we call this comorbidity. And so many people who have a substance use disorder we now also develop other mental illnesses. Just as many people who are diagnosed with mental illness are often diagnosed with a substance use disorder. For example, to give you an example, about half of the people who experience a mental illness will also experience a substance use disorder at some point in their life, and vice versa. However, this does not mean that one caused the other, even if one appeared first. In fact, establishing which one can come first can be very difficult. However, research points to basically to three different possibilities that might answer this question. First, there are common risk factors that can contribute to both mental illness and substance use disorder. There are certain genes that can contribute to the risk of developing both substance use disorder and mental illnesses. And genes can also influence how a person responds to a drug. For example, whether or not using a drug makes them really feel good. And second, mental illnesses can contribute to drug use and addiction. And some mental health conditions have been identified as risk factors for developing addiction. And you both certainly know that people with mental illnesses may use drugs or alcohol as form of self-medication. And they are certainly then also affected. This has a lot of side effects. And also the third, addiction may change the brain in ways that make the person more likely to develop mental illnesses.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that holds true with my experience with my grandmother and how she had both bipolar disorder and alcoholism. Gary, what in your experience, either personally or through your work with Shatterproof, how does that resonate? Do you find that that's often true, and how do mental illnesses and substance use disorders intermix and play off each other from your knowledge?
Completely, I completely agree. Let me go back to one point that Stephan said first, and then I'll answer that. Risk factors. We can't do everything as a young organization, so we're more focused on treatment than we are in prevention. Having said that, we've been very involved in the safer prescribing of opioids. We've been one of the leading advocates in the country for the CDC's guidelines on the safer prescribing, and continue to work to get that implemented. Having said that, Stephan mentioned risk factors, and that's the broader, a broader way of looking at prevention. If I had known as a parent the risk factors of my two children growing up having addiction or becoming addicted, I would have done things differently as a parent. If I had known that age of first use is a huge risk factor. Across all substances, if the first time someone uses a substance is age 21, 4% likely to become addicted. Age 19 to 21, 8%. 17 to 19, 13%. Below 15, 23%. And that is, and Stephan knows all these numbers as well, I'm sure, and that is the average population. If you have a mental health issue or you have ADD, all those numbers I gave you are higher. If you don't have a mental health issue or ADD or some other factor, then all those numbers are lower. Think of how much our society would be happier if we just took what I just said and what Stephan just said, the risk factors and protective factors, and had one sheet of paper and every parent learned that the day your child was born and you learned it and kept it. How many less people in this country would become addicted or ever have an issue? As far as your specific question related to comorbidity between addiction and mental health, 50%, approximately 50% of those addicted, 40 to 60%, have a mental health issue. There's absolutely crossover. And that's why I mentioned earlier, I see One Mind frame behind you, working with organizations like One Mind, who are primarily mental health focused, where Shatterproof is addiction focused. But there's a lot that we can do together because there's such comorbidity. Getting this into medical schools, it all should be taught in medical schools, not just addiction. We can work together to get that done, et cetera, et cetera. I can go on forever on this. I mean, yes, and yes to what Stephan said.
We'd love to work with you on this. so impressed with your organization, what it's doing, and what we can do together. And Stephan, you mentioned factors, as Gary just called out. And are there other risk factors you can identify in brain changes that you can see in the brain that can be like shown to families to help them know that they're might be at risk, or as an individual they might be at risk?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about genetic risk factors, but they are also going back to a little bit what Gary said. There are environmental factors associated with addiction vulnerability. And there, as Gary mentioned a couple of them, there's also, for example, early life trauma, a disrupted family structure, and peer pressure. Think about the students even here at UC Berkeley. There's a lot of pressure to perform well, and so we are putting a lot of pressure on students at a very young age. And some might manage this pressure better than others, and people who might not very well manage this pressure, they might be guided or might be led into addiction or substance use disorders. And so again, this is because Gary mentioned the age. The earlier you take a drug, the higher the risk is of developing addiction. So it's really important also here at our universities to inform the students about these risks associated with addiction and taking drugs of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So, and stress, obviously. I mean, we are living right now in a time of high uncertainty and stress, emotional distress. So stress is an important factor that can lead to substance use disorders and also relapse. So in addiction, relapse is one of the most important concerns or problems we have. Even if we get people away from taking the drugs, if we don't put them in a supportive social system, the danger of that they relapse is extremely high. So what we need to do is take the people that are affected by addiction, take them out of their environment and bring them in a supportive environment. And that has been shown to be extremely important for a successful recovery from addiction.
And that's exactly what Gary was talking about with the stigma angle. You know, in order to help people feel supported, you have to reduce the stigma in society. So it all fits together. This is amazing. So we're talking today with Gary Mendell, founder and CEO of Shatterproof, and also Dr. Stephan Lammel, who is a assistant professor of neurobiology at University of California, Berkeley, about fighting addictions. And audience, feel free to ask questions of our guests at any time. So I want to ask one more question before we go to our final question of both of you. So the psychological toll, Stephan, of the coronavirus pandemic is taking a huge toll on people's mental health. And with regard to comorbidity, like we just discussed, do you have concerns about how the pandemic will affect people's ability to stay sober or to not develop addiction?
Yeah, Brandon. I mean, we know that times of crisis often see a rise in the use of abuse and other intoxicating substances, talking from cocaine to heroin to alcohol. And the current coronavirus pandemic is no different. Fear and anxiety can be overwhelming and cause strong emotions and stress. And this increased stress, as I said, can lead to increases in alcohol and substance use, but also to relapse. But there's also another concern, which is maybe more unique to this current coronavirus pandemic, which is the ramification of the national lockdown for individuals with substance use disorder. There can be an increased risk because of social distancing and isolation measures, and it's been harder to get support and access to recovery programs for affected individuals. That's why, as I mentioned previously, social support in addiction treatments and recovery is absolutely crucial for successful recovery. And I also want to mention that some populations with substance use disorders may be particularly hit hard under the current situation. Because we know that coronavirus attacks the lungs, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 could be an especially serious threat to those who smoke tobacco, marijuana, or even vape. People with opioid disorder, and again, think we currently have in our country an opioid epidemic in addition to a coronavirus pandemic. So people with opioid use disorders and methamphetamine use disorders may also be vulnerable due to the effects of the drugs on the respiratory system. And people suffering from opioid disorders, they may be even led to an opioid overdose due to the current situation and the social isolation associated with the national lockdown. And additionally, what I want to mention is that individuals with substance use disorder are also more likely to experience homelessness or incarceration than those in the general population. And these circumstances pose unique challenges regarding transmission of the virus that causes COVID-19. So Brandon, so yes, people that are affected by substance use disorder are probably suffering even more now in the current situation. And again, it's important to state how important it is that these people still get the help they need today, not when the pandemic has passed, because for some, that might be even too late.
That's right. We need to get people the help they need all the time, because people will go downhill if they don't get the help they need, and only thrive if we can get them help. Gary, how does this resonate with you? What are you most concerned about during the pandemic?
Well, throughout this, consistent with how I've been for the last 45 minutes, I completely agree with Stephan. Statistically, it just came out that in the month of May, 42% increase in deaths in the month of May, overdose in the month of May. I'm not overdose deaths, overdoses in the month of May, 42%. So that's numbers to back up intuitive, what subjectively we heard out of Stephan of you would think, you would believe that would happen, and then we saw real data that showed that. The social isolation, the worry about losing your job, the losing your job and worrying about rent, on and on, not being able to get to treatment, on and on and on someone not being there if you relapse to be able to help you because you're socially isolated. All the factors come into play that this is a pandemic upon a pandemic. And where I started in my remarks when you asked why did I start Shatterproof is because this is significantly fixable. Can I look you or Stephan or anybody watching in the eye and say we can end this tomorrow? No, we can't. Can we cut it in half tomorrow? Yes. By taking the research that already exists about risk and protective factors to prevent many of our loved ones from ever becoming addicted. For those who do become addicted, using the treatment protocols that research has already shown to work. And for the public to understand that this is a treatable disease with success rates no different than diabetes, heart disease, or asthma. And if someone has this disease, let's treat them with all the love and respect that anyone who has cancer or heart disease has. And yes, you can live next door to them because this treatment is effective.
That's very hopeful to hear, extraordinarily hopeful to hear. Powerful, powerful words, Gary. Final question for the two of you, Gary and then Stephan. Gary, can you please elaborate? What words of hope do you have specifically for those who are struggling with addiction and their families and loved ones?
Yeah, to those that are affected by addiction, I really want to tell them that you are not alone. And having a strong social network of others who understand addiction and have gone through similar experiences can provide you with much needed support and insight. In particular, during these uncertain and difficult times of the coronavirus pandemic. Please keep in touch with friends and family and do the best to stick to a schedule. For example, as we heard, if you have any hobbies like music or something which you can relate to and which you enjoy doing. So maintaining a structured routine can be very helpful. And then I want to address to those that if you believe you have a friend that has substance use disorders, reach out to them and remind them of your support, offer encouragement and optimism. Again, social support is absolutely crucial to a successful recovery. And since we talked a lot about stigma, and the stigma, as we mentioned throughout this discussion surrounding substance abuse and addiction, is extremely difficult to overcome. And I think I would like to end this with a citation of Michelle Obama, who really said, sadly, too often the stigma around mental health prevents people who need help from seeking it. But that simply doesn't make any sense. Whether an illness affects your heart, your arm, or your brain, it's still an illness, and there shouldn't be any distinction. We would never tell someone with a broken leg that they should stop swallowing and get it together. We don't consider taking medication for an ear infection something to be ashamed of. And so this is what Michelle Obama said, and I think it's so important to always remind yourself about this. This applies to any mental illness, no matter what it is. Is it schizophrenia? Is it depression? Or is it substance abuse disorder?
Here. Anyone experiencing a mental health challenge or a substance abuse disorder, I urge you to talk about it with somebody who you trust and seek treatment or at least advice and help from a professional. It can make a difference. It did for me. Gary, do you have any words of hope you'd like to add?
Sure, just a few. I think Stephan, again, was very eloquent, and I completely agree with everything he said. For anyone listening here, if you have a substance use disorder, I've never met anybody who said, I reached to the sky one day and said, God, addict me. It happened. No different than someone developing any other chronic illness. It happens. And you are as valuable to your family and loved by your family as anyone else. And you have a disease that is treatable, just like diabetes, heart disease, and asthma. And so please don't let this temporary moment in time, where when I say moment, it's decades, but over the history of the world, it's a moment in time where you're being stigmatized, get to you. Realize that you are a wonderful human being inside. You happen to be struggling with a disease. We're here to help. And because society is not ready exactly today, they're gonna be ready. And you can be a part of it. And we would love to, for anyone who would like to be part of Shatterproof community in doing so, please go to our website, the One Mind community, go to their website, join each of us, join one of us, join with us, because together, as Stephan said, together, we can create change. You're not alone.
Powerful words. That's so awesome. Gary, you speak so from the heart, and I'm motivated to really get on board with what you're advocating for, as I have been for many years. You're doubling my motivation. Thank you. Viewers, thank you too. Stephan and Gary, thank you for participating today. And viewers, if you have any follow-up questions for Stephan or Gary, you can post them on onemind.org/brainwaves. If you'd like to learn more about Shatterproof, go to www.shatterproof.org, or about Stephan Lammel's work as a scientist, visit www.lammellab.org. That's LAMMELLAB.org. Thanks so much, everybody, for watching.
You're feeling anxious, afraid, alone.
I haven't been able to see my family or my friends.
Families that struggled to find mental health care before find it even harder now.
I feel a lot of guilt in not being with my family.
Are there solutions? Visit onemind.org, seeking the answers, bringing help to the front lines, accelerating brain health for all. Help us fund new treatments at onemind.org.